Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. Following the Biden-Yoon summit in Seoul, the high-ranking officials from the two countries met in a series of the meetings, and the U.S. and South Korea are vowing to deter North Korea if it conducts a nuclear test, talking specifically about adding new sanctions. Today, we'll discuss how the two allies can keep up pressure on North Korea when the nuclear test could be imminent.
And we are prepared to make both short and longer term adjustments to our military posture.
It will only strengthen our deterrence and also international sanctions.
What we can do in terms of imposing additional sanctions on North Korea in light of their destabilizing activity.
In the studio with me is David Asher, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute. Dr. Asher served at the State Department as Senior Advisor for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and Special Coordinator of North Korea Working Group. Also joining me is Joshua Stanton, a lawyer in Washington, D.C. Mr. Stanton has helped the U.S. Congress draft numerous North Korea sanctions bills and laws. The views he expresses are his own. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
The U.S. and South Korea seem to be in sync on how they will have to increase pressure on North Korea if North Korea conducts its seventh nuclear test. And according to South Korean Foreign Minister Park Jin, the U.S. and South Korea will push for new UN Security Council sanctions. Dr. Asher, is this a right move for them?
Sanctions are important, but they're not enough. I mean, there's going to need to be a wider range of actions to try to impact North Korea's nuclear program itself. I mean, there are many things that the U.S. and South Korea have in their suite of capabilities, including cyber operations and other technical operations. We really need to try to start to apply some of the Iranian toolkit to North Korea. Something that I, having worked on Iran and North Korea in my career, I can't say what that toolkit is, but imagine that we have such a thing. And we need to start to make North Korea's nuclear life as difficult as possible. And we're going to have to start to deprive North Korea of its ability to steal money around the world. Right now, that's a huge issue in terms of how the nuclear program is being funded. So you've got to cut the flow of money, and you've got to try to impact their ability to actually carry out nuclear tests and capability development.
Mr. Stanton, Dr. Asher said sanctions are not enough. What's your view on this?
Well, it's true that sanctions alone are not enough, and I think that one of the most important and neglected parts of a whole of government policy is information operations directed at the North Korean people. But when we talk about sanctions, before we get to new sanctions, we have to look at the enforcement of the existing sanctions. Since about mid-2018, the level of enforcement has fallen back to the record low levels that we haven't seen in 10 years. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have simply failed at enforcing the sanctions we already have. When you go back to the United Nations Security Council and you bargain for sanctions with China and Russia, which are not going to cooperate with this effort, what you're really doing is you're sending a message that you're doing something when in fact we have done nothing with respect to sanctions enforcement, other than a few moderately significant actions just this year. We actually had a full year with 0 North Korea sanctions designations whatsoever preceding December 2021. So the real important priority needs to be enforcing the authorities that already exist and doing so in a way that's harmonized with the efforts of our allies that issue convertible currencies.
I just want to say
Sure.
I totally agree. I mean, the verification and compliance of sanctions is almost non-existent in the entire U.S. government. We have a one and done policy, so we'll hit an entity, and very rarely do we ever follow up on anyone. Even Al Qaeda, Hezbollah, North Korea, Iran. It is a remarkably big problem, as is the issue of the so-called 50% rule, which is that if a sanctioned entity shifts its ownership so that it's only controlled by 49% of the parent sanctioned party, it's no longer sanctioned under most interpretations of sanctions. So what do people do when they get sanctioned? They just cut their ownership. They might change an address. They might change a fax number even. They might not even move. Most of the time they don't. So there's an enormous number of North Korean sanctioned entities, for example, in northern China, that are have been sanctioned, but they're operating free and clear as far as business right now, because the sanctions aren't being updated. So they can still essentially launder money through the United States or make transfer payments. And whether banks are supposed to enforce the sanctions or not, they're just not doing it. So it's a big problem.
Can I follow up on David's comment a little? There are 3 major Chinese banks right now that are subject to grand jury or Patriot Act subpoenas in the local U.S. District Court. This has been an ongoing case since 2018. That doesn't include the time that the grand jury was looking at the prosecutor's evidence. The FBI has been following the money laundered through the United States very closely. This is not for lack of targets. And yet we have not seen the political will on the part of the Biden administration either penalize or prosecute those banks the way the Obama administration did with the European banks, the banks of our allies that were violating Iran sanctions. This is a lack of political will. This is a policy failure, and it is a bipartisan policy failure to enforce our laws. The Chinese banking industry is violating our money laundering laws and violating our sanctions laws, and they have been given de facto immunity by our Treasury Department.
Not fully following through the sanctions, is that because there's lack of a sense of urgency within the administration or U.S. government?
I think that there's a idea that coercive diplomacy is somehow not a polite way of conducting international relations, and it frankly happened under Trump too. I mean, I was in the Trump administration for the last year as one of the leading officials in arms control and running all the arms control intelligence issues. And I mean, we let the Chinese off the hook in terms of allowing their banks to escape prosecution, as well as I would call it sort of persecution from sanctions under OFAC. And we frankly, put diplomacy ahead of everything else. That President Trump fell in love with these letters from Kim Jong-un, the love letters as we call them, and became convinced that he could make a deal because he's a deal-making guy. My counsel to the White House was, we're never going to get a deal with this guy. And it was the same counsel I gave President Obama, President Clinton, and President Bush, since I've worked for all of them. There's some regimes you're just not going to deal with. So what you've got to do is you've got to aim to provide the conditions of containment and constrainment, and aim to counter, protect, deter their activities.
You talked about China. There are some members of the U.S. Congress calling for stronger enforcement of sanctions on Chinese entities that are helping North Korea's illegal activities. Why? So is it because of the lack of political will that is not fully enforced on Chinese entities?
There was minimal enforcement on Chinese entities, the most notorious being run by a woman named Mao Xiaohong. It's a company called Dandong Hongqing Trading Corporation. It has spread massively in many aspects since it was designated. You can see it in the data that the Sayari, the company that I helped start, actually collects for the government and the U.S. and many other governments, as well as banks. It's publicly available. I mean, they've changed their name and established new offices all over Dandong. Many of which, though, are in the same building they were housed in before. So they just they basically, we're sort of being laughed at by the North Koreans, as far as I can tell. I mean, they're managing to steal between $1 and $2 billion a year in Bitcoin and other sources of money from gambling sites and gaming sites. They are engaged still in drug trafficking and other illegal activities, which no one seems to want to pay attention to. Counterfeit cigarette sales are continuing to be very substantial. Our regime opposition strategy is essentially non-existent in this state, as far as I'm concerned.
Mr. Stanton.
Let me add a point to the Mao Zedong case that Mr. Asher talked about. In that case, Secretary Liu, during the Obama administration, had asked the Chinese government to cooperate with anti-money laundering enforcement with respect to 12 Chinese banks that held accounts for that conglomerate. And the Chinese government essentially ignored us. They did nothing, and the prosecutors in D.C. in a subsequent case later told the entire story. So that's all in the appellate record. Appealing to China's sense of fair play or justice is futility itself. Also, let's not forget the other bad actor here. Most of that money that is laundered through those Chinese banks constitutes the proceed of coal that is being smuggled through Russian and Chinese ports in broad daylight. There is authority in the existing sanctions laws to target the ports for import sanctions that are involved in that smuggling. Neither the Trump nor the Biden administration has used those authorities. They're really failing to take advantage of the authorities we already have. By going back to the UN, we're essentially going to be bargaining with the very parties that have been undermining the sanctions for all these years, asking them to agree to another resolution they're just going to turn around and violate. It's really time for us to look inward, to enforce the laws we have, and to do this in a way in which we work with our allies.
What about White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan very recently said he has expressed to China U.S. concerns over North Korea's possible nuclear tests, and he said we'll have to see how this is going to play out. Mr. Stanton, how will this play out?
Probably exactly the same way it played out since 2006, when we've said almost exactly the same words every single occasion since then. Look, when I first heard the words maximum pressure, what I said then is what I say now. I will believe it's maximum pressure when I see a 9-digit civil penalty against a Chinese bank for laundering North Korea's money through our banking system. That has still not happened. And when it does, then I will believe that we are serious, and maybe so will the Chinese banking industry.
Dr. Asher, so is it realistically difficult for the U.S. and China to cooperate on North Korea sanctions?
Well, in the wake of the designation of Banco-Delta-Asia in 2005 in September, which I led for the U.S. government, North Korea was dramatically affected, as everyone knows. I think people didn't understand. It was a small bank. It was inside a casino, primarily called the Lisboa Casino, which was run by Stanley Ho, who's basically the biggest. He's gone, he's dead, but he was the biggest mobster, essentially, in Macau and in Asia, more or less. The man behind the 14K triad, which was the largest Chinese organized crime organization. But the key thing was that bank was putting, there's $25 million seized by the Chinese authorities in that bank. That's like what went through it every day, okay? Or maybe every week. It depended on the day or the week. How did we know? Well, we had penetrated the bank. It became public to some extent in some of the court documents. But, we knew what was going on, and we understood how it was acting as a funnel. What did the Chinese do when we outed that relationship? First things, they called me and asked me for help. They said, "What can I do to help you? Please, we'll do anything you need." It wasn't like, "Oh my God, you did this to our bank. We're going to go after you." Because remember, Macau is part of China, so it's a Chinese bank. I mean, it was amazing when you hear, directly from the Ministry of Public Security, an organization which does not communicate with the U.S. government normally, the central bank governor. I mean, we were getting contacted by everybody. And for the following year after Banco Delta, we engaged in a number of task force with the Chinese where we actually did do some enforcement activities that had some impact on North Korea. It turned out to be all reversed when North Korea did the nuclear test. I guess the first one was it 06 or 7? I don't even remember what year was it, John?
So 2006.
2006, but the Chinese did react, and then the North Koreans did the test, and then we reacted because, oh my God, North Korea's got a nuclear bomb. What are we going to do about it?
And it's clear that the Chinese still do react the same way, because I mentioned these 3 Chinese banks that are now currently supposed to be returning subpoenas. They've been held in contempt of court and fined $50,000 a day, which kind of adds up. Those banks, it is apparent if you read the unsealed portions of the docket, the Chinese government has intervened in those cases to try to persuade the U.S. government not to enforce this through the courts and to go back to this mutual legal assistance treaty that the Chinese have frankly never respected. Until, again, they lose their de facto immunity, they are going to laugh at us.
Mr. Stanton, can we come up with something as strong as we did in the past? In the Banco Delta case?
The authorities are there. I think, look, these 3 banks should be our focus. There should be a 2-tier effort that begins with the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, which is a new authority by a very concerned Congress. It starts with governments that have willfully laundered money through the United States, and the subpoenas will tell us this ultimately, should be prosecuted. Look, when BNP Paribas, the French bank, violated these same laws to violate Iran sanctions, they had combined $11 billion with a B in fines, penalties, and forfeitures. Something like that against a bank that has willfully violated our sanctions, perhaps one of these 3, perhaps all of these 3, would certainly be an attention getter. The second thing we need to do with respect to, say, the 12 banks that were involved in the Dandong Hongxiang case, which were merely negligent. Now, they have failed an obligation to do what is called enhanced due diligence under the Patriot Act, and if they have essentially negligently let North Korea launder money through their banks, then they should face increased Patriot Act restrictions on their access to the financial system, including enhanced due diligence obligations that apply to them.
Dr. Usher, if there's one area that you go after, as you did in the past with Banco Delta Asia, what would it be?
Well, I go after the regime itself. To me, the main target is to oppose the communist regime in North Korea and to work assiduously to not only oppose it, but to depose it, basically, to put it out of power. People think we don't have the capabilities to do this. I'm very confident we do. I'm confident from my experience. People say, well, we didn't have a regime change policy. Well, we had a regime alteration policy. If we had a determined policy to displace the Kim regime, I think within 1 to 2 years we could have a high degree of impact. Whether we succeed fully or not, we're going to get the guy's attention to the point that we actually start to see not a regime we can deal with, but a regime that's in a weaker position. Now, will it lash out with nuclear weapons? Will it lash out with proliferation? Sure. Is it going to do that anyway? Yeah. Why is North Korea building so many nuclear weapons? Why are they doing so many tests? I would assume it's because there's nuclear weapons for sale. The lesson I see, and I've been involved in Russia-Ukraine events recently and chasing Putin's money around the world, is that the Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and now look what it's paying. So there's governments all over the Middle East, I can tell you that, having spent almost as much of my career in the Middle East as in East Asia, that are looking very actively for nuclear weapons, and the North Koreans have weapons to sell. We have to make a massive effort to counterproliferation against North Korea immediately, but it also needs to be part of a regime opposition strategy, because frankly, this regime is on a course of collision against the entire world. And Josh is absolutely right. There are many targets that are not that difficult to have an impact on. These Chinese banks, we already have the legal grounds to act on them. They've already, essentially, they haven't defended themselves in a way that is consistent with being not guilty. They're essentially guilty. They know they're guilty. They're paying a fine every day. We need to pounce on these things. And we do need to hold the Chinese accountable, because when North Korea's nuclear program was running around the world, with AQ Khan and building the reactor in Syria and many other things, which I, can't talk about beyond what happened in Libya.
What would be one point advice for U.S. government officials who is in charge of sanctions on North Korea?
Put
Mr.
it all
Stanton
together. Let's not try to separate sanctions enforcement and proliferation from the suffering of the people. I think one of the great avenues for cooperation with our allies is to agree to invoke the UN Convention against transnational organized crime and against corruption, to take the forfeited or confiscated proceeds of North Korea's money laundering and kleptocracy, and to set those aside and to say that that money will be available for humanitarian aid if and when we have the ability to monitor that it gets to the people who need it. Money in North Korea is the root of all evil, and we have to go after that evil at its source in concert with allies that agree with us on that principle.
Dr. Usher.
So an outright regime opposition strategy needs to come to pass. It should have happened under Trump in the last 2 years. It did happen the first 2 years. And then the president, again, fell in love with these love letters from North Korea. The North Koreans just have been playing us, as have the Chinese, for decades. We need to realize that the game is up. And right now, we're losing. So if we don't reverse the course they're on, ultimately the North Koreans are going to do things which will cause global instability, and it will become a problem on the peninsula, whether the U.S., the ROK likes it or not.
North Korea has named recently its longtime nuclear negotiator, Choi Sun-hee, as a new foreign minister. Mr. Stanton, do you think this is North Korea getting ready for talks with the United States?
I don't think the naming of any particular individual as a North Korean diplomat should be read as particularly significant. The decisions about North Korea's positions are decided inside Kim Jong-un's palace and within the Organization and Guidance Department. Diplomats are mouthpieces. They don't have control over policy. They simply communicate policies that are set in Pyongyang.
Dr. Usher, your thought?
Well, of course, I know Madam Choi quite well over the years in our discussions. I would agree. She's a mouthpiece, but she does convey a certain amount of influence. During the six-party talks, she'd frequently act as the translator, and she'd say something in English that was totally different than was being said in Korean. So she does, I think, have a little bit more influence, and she probably does have a tie up to the Organization Guidance Department as a mouthpiece for them, not just the foreign ministry. But that doesn't mean she can make a decision. She's just an interface. She's basically there to tie us down, slow us down, and allow North Korea the room to continue to pursue other agendas around the world. And hopefully, her goal is essentially to extract funds from us and from South Korea.
North Korea continues to show signs suggesting it is preparing for a nuclear test. And very ironically, North Korea has taken the helm of a UN-linked conference on disarmament. Many watchers wonder if North Korea will go as far as testing its nuclear weapon when it is heading this nuclear disarmament forum. Dr. Usher and Mr. Stanton, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.